By Gita. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, dear friend and guide Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Bless us with your inspiring presence, that we may feel your insights flowing into us and receive not merely ideas, but new experiences that awaken us to the divine power inherent in this scripture. We are your children. We long with all our hearts to live in thy light. Guide us, awaken us, bless us in all ways. Om. Peace. Amen. Okay, let's do it. Hot water. So we are in chapter 6 of the Gita. We are in, I think, chapter 18 or 19 of the book, which is called chapter 18. The chapter is called The True Yoga. So chapter 6 of the Gita, verse number 5. Let man uplift himself by his own effort, and let him not debase himself. Indeed, oneself is his own greatest friend, or, if he so chooses, his own greatest enemy. And that self is written with a small s, so we're not talking about the divine self. They, when they talk about reincarnation and everybody who's just getting involved in reincarnation, meaning beginning to think about it, you have all these funny ideas in your mind about, today I'm a lizard, tomorrow I'm the king of Spain, the next day I'm a tiger in the African savannah, then I'm a servant girl. And it's just sort of, you get this picture of this kind of ping-ponging around, just being this for a while and that for the while, a very disorderly concept of the universe. And it is all very interesting when you sort of get more into it. And it's now been quite a lot of years that I've been thinking about it, but I do remember trying to understand and ask the most obvious and interesting questions. Do animals reincarnate? How do you decide how you go forward? Master is reputed to have said, Swami never told us this, but it's said to be true, that Master said that he remembered himself back to the level of a diamond. And the word for it in Sanskrit is jiva. And jiva is that defined, recognizable spark of individuality that makes you who you are from creation to self-realization. And so when Master says that he remembered back to being a diamond, it was that same bubble of the sea that was at one point a crystal, a diamond, and then gradually awoke more and more until he became a self-realized master. It's hard to actually figure out how that works, except I wear astrological rings. I have 3 of them. They're now like my equivalent of brass knuckles, all in one hand. Just because of the way my fingers are made, it was easier to put them all in one hand. And they're 3 individual gemstones, and each one of them was very individual to me. 2 of them I picked out in person with a pile of gemstones in front of me, the yellow and the green one. And there was a little community of gemstones, and one of them very distinctly, in each case, was definitely the one I wanted. There was just no question. The third one I bought on the internet, where I was just looking at all these different stones. Just, they all looked the same in the pictures, and there were these specifications, and I was looking for several weeks because I just didn't quite know how I was going to do this. All of a sudden, I just opened the internet. There was a stone. It just had certain characteristics, but it was just like, oh, that's mine. And I just bought it just like that. And it was exactly the right one. I felt perfect about having it. So Swamiji himself talked about, years ago, this was in the early 80s, he went to Paris. And at that time in Paris, there was a museum display or an art gallery display of very large crystals. I don't mean large like a dinner plate, but large like a piece of furniture. He said just these huge crystals, natural crystals that had just been allowed to grow and became enormous like that. I saw in National Geographic magazine, I'm pretty sure that was the magazine, where somewhere in South America or perhaps in Mexico, I'm not sure, there's a mountain that has silver inside the mountain, but it was flooded inside the mountain. So they engineered it in such a way as to drain the water out of the mountain so they could go in and get the silver. And they discovered that there were crystals growing that had been growing for millennia inside that mountain. And these crystals were as big as buildings. And there were these pictures. There's actually some kind of a film about it. I saw this again years ago. And the conditions inside the mountain it was very hot. I mean, like 110, 120. So you could go in there as a person, as a human, and not die, but it was arduous. So it wasn't something that just all the tourists could go. Unbelievable. All I saw was pictures and film, and when Swami went to the Paris exhibit, he said afterwards, you felt like you were in the presence of sentient beings, of individualized beings with unique consciousness of their own. Master said every atom of creation is dowered with individuality, and every sentient being is an individual. We retain our individuality into God realization, and that individuality can also reassert itself whenever it chooses. That's how Jesus can appear to St. Francis and to St. Teresa of Avila, and how great masters can manifest again. People have visions of Krishna. It's really Krishna. He really just, at the call of the devotee, remanifests. Sri Yukteswar remanifested after his death. So Swami said he felt he was in the presence of sentient beings, but it was not a human consciousness. It was just a different consciousness, is the only way he could put it. And when I saw the pictures of those enormous crystals, you see these little people and then standing next to these enormous crystals, you could feel there was something coming out of there. Swami remarked that he thought crystals, of which gemstones are a species of crystal, I guess, he said he thought they were the transition between conscious and unconscious. It's like it's when they're beginning to become conscious. And they do have personalities. Some gemstones have evil personalities, that they hold negative realities in them. And crystals can take on the consciousness of what you put into them. Many healers, some healers will use crystals, will hold them, because they'll transfer energy. And there's this crystal that was found, for some reason I want to say in Canada, I'm not sure. There's this gentleman named Marcel Vogel. He's been off the planet for a long time. He was a real pioneer in the use of crystals for healing and so on like that. And he had a very, very altered consciousness, psychic consciousness. He was a friend of Kriyananda's, and I met him on various occasions with Swamiji. His job, he was employed at a good salary full-time with IBM company. And he was allowed to do whatever he wanted to do. But anything that he thought of or invented, IBM owned. And that was the deal that they sort of made. So he invented and thought of things, and as a consequence, he was just supported to be an eccentric genius. But somewhere in this context, somewhere there was a carved crystal skull, which has been discovered and is a fact and is a physical object that's in a museum somewhere. And no one could quite figure out what that skull was for. And Marcel said, and he himself said, this was the vision he had of this. And the vision was some healing temple in Satya Yuga, the highest yuga, in Atlantis. And I think maybe it wasn't in Atlantis necessarily, it was just in a very high age. And an old man came into this healing temple, and he lay down, and all the life experience and knowledge he'd gained went from his consciousness into the crystal. And then a young boy came in, and he lay down, and all the knowledge and understanding of the old man went from the crystal into the boy. A much more efficient form of education than putting us in those classrooms for all those years. Is it just a story? Is it the truth? So much of what goes on in the world now, 150 years ago, the people would have thought we were absolutely certifiably mad. This, for example, precisely exactly what I'm doing, which we just take for granted now. This did not exist when I was a young adult. It was out of the question. But to speak of 100 years ago, which is not as old as I am. So all of that is to say, when Master remembered himself all the way back down to being the diamond, someone said to me, how long does it take to evolve from being a diamond? And then I had the obvious next question, and then what comes next? And they say that the diamond, the expense of the diamond was created by the diamond industry, that they were the ones who created the idea that if a man really loved a woman, he would buy her a diamond and all of that. And the whole idea of a diamond representing engagement to marriage was apparently a brilliant ad campaign. The real power of gemstones, and which is why I wear them and people do, besides the fact that they're beautiful, and if they're nice, they're good friends, is because they have relationships to the planets, and the planets have relationships to the chakras, and the chakras have to do with our karma and our destiny, and thus enlightened astrology comes into the picture. You don't just randomly go out and buy things. You have to make sure that it's beneficial for your horoscope, but you couldn't really say that one gemstone is more valuable than another, because all of the planets play together, and it depends how they're placed. Princess Diana of England, who died in that tragic car accident, was wearing a lot of blue sapphires because she had a new admirer, and the man was exceedingly wealthy, and he bought her many blue sapphires. Certain astrologers have said that given her horoscope, all those blue sapphires were terrible for her to wear. And that, part of what created the confluence of her passing was the malevolent influence of all those blue sapphires. Now, of course, it was destiny. It was going to happen for reasons that are bigger than sapphires. But interesting. Still, it's like an interesting comment. Her life was unfortunate in many ways, and she was wearing astrologically incorrect stones, which didn't help. Let's just put it like that. Now, having said all of that, where I was really starting was I was talking about, the evolution of animals up to the human level. I had a point 15 minutes ago when I started in on all of this, which is that through the animal stages, so Swamiji has explained it, progress is automatic. And what progress means is that different life forms have more potential for life experience, and more potential for varied life experience, and more active intelligence and awareness. For example, you could look at a clam, which is rooted to a coral reef, and it opens its mouth, and if whatever is floating by is what it wants, it closes its mouth, and it's nurtured, and it grows. But I mean, to begin with, it has no mobility, and it just doesn't have a lot of varied experience. You know, Swami says the expression happy as a clam, which is an expression, at least in America, is a pretty low concept of happiness. It's rooted to the spot, opening your mouth and swallowing the plankton. I mean, it's just like boring is what comes to mind, you know? It's not much. So if you're going to like grow from being a clam, you could become a fish that moves. And then at least you have a little more variety and you have more adventures and you're in more danger because something else will eat you, although the clam, lots of people eat the clam too. Somebody was talking about rabbits. It was actually Anandi, whose husband Bharat is the leader in nature awareness, Joseph Cornell. So from him she knows a lot of things. And she was talking about rabbits. She said the problem with being a rabbit is that everything eats the rabbit. It's just like, it's very hard to like really feel secure because everybody, including humans, consider you quite a tasty dinner. And that's not true of every animal, but it's definitely true of the rabbit. But you evolve through the animal stages, Master said, just automatically, like the tide coming in, because you don't have the self-awareness to reflect on your condition. You don't have the ego development to be able to objectively consider your reality. Every sentient being has the pain-pleasure impulse, which is when even you take a snail and you poke it, you take a worm and you poke it with something sharp, it will endeavor to get away from you. It can tell that it's being hurt. It won't passively just sit there and allow itself to be hurt. It'll try to get away from you. So Master made this the basis of his book, The Science of Religion. The science of religion is that every sentient being has a desire for more happiness and less pain. Whatever they describe as happiness, which of course varies enormously, for the clam, just having a lot of plankton float by would probably be the height of happiness for it. But most human beings really would not have the same pleasure response to all that plankton floating by. It wouldn't mean anything to us. But nonetheless, for the clam, that's its positive. For the worm, there's a positive. For the lizard, there's a positive. And the creature, instinctively, just goes toward whatever that might be. Safety. The rabbit, who's always afraid of being eaten, gets down into its hole and it feels slightly more safe. So its pleasure is greater, its pain is less. But it can't objectify its experience. You go and get a puppy and there's a litter of 8 puppies and you take one of the puppies, and while the puppies are growing together, they're in the womb of the mother together, and then they're all bundled up together and they play together and they might even have, you know, preferences among their siblings. But when you come and take that puppy and you take that puppy to California and someone else takes the puppy to New York City and then, emigrates to Australia and takes the puppy all the way to Australia, and one of them goes to a friend in, who knows where, the deserts of Arizona. But the puppy that's come home with you just knows that it's your puppy, like this. And it doesn't sit and contemplate, I wonder what happened to my litter mates. I wonder if they all found good homes. I've heard that the one that went to New York went all the way to Europe. I wish I could go to Europe. It just doesn't have the intelligence, it doesn't have the brain, and it doesn't have the ego development. See, ego development is as we become self-aware. That's sort of how it develops. It becomes self-aware. I don't think the clam has any objective sense that it's a clam. It just instinctively opens its mouth and is fed and isn't, and maybe is finally ripped off the coral reef and thrown into a pot. But I don't think it laments its fate when it gets there. It might shrink from the boiling water because the pain and pleasure principle is there. But it also, and it's an interesting fact, a great deal of suffering is based on the human level on having the ego development to be able to know that I am suffering. And even more than that, to be able to say, I shouldn't be suffering, or I wouldn't be suffering except that you caused it, or they caused it, or I made the wrong turn. But we have all these objective ways in our, what actually also leads us to freedom, also leads us into more and more bondage. And that's why so-called civilized people often suffer in more extraordinary ways than people who have less sophistication in their view of the world. They just take life as it comes. And they don't have this, why is this happening to me? Because it doesn't occur to them to think about themselves in that light. And so the way Master talks about it is the animals just move upward automatically. And they sort of have mass karma, as he put it, rather than individual karma, until they get to a more refined level. Master said the most advanced animals are dogs, horses, and monkeys, from the point of view of moving toward the human level, which is actually the goal of it all, moving toward the human level and having increasing awareness. And with the awareness comes moral character, because with increasing awareness, the puppy, for example, or the horse, can develop great loyalties to those. It's conscious of the individuals who take care of it. It has the capacity to bond with those individuals, and many times in extraordinary ways has the capacity to make intelligent decisions for the benefit of those it loves, even extraordinary self-sacrificing decisions for the benefit of those that they love, especially the higher animals. Now, it's also known, I mean, birds, lizards, mice, I mean, many little creatures, if they get in connection with human beings. Now, we have this sentimental thought that all wild animals should live in the wild, and there is a certain truth to it if where they're taken imprisons them and limits their reality, but it's not entirely true, because where we're going as jivas from being a diamond or whatever we were, you're sort of hard to piece together all that whole cycle. Is a diamond higher or lower than a pine tree? And is a pine tree more advanced than a redwood, or is a redwood more advanced? I mean, when I asked Swami the question about how long does it take to stop being a diamond, I brought the question to him at the end of his life, 2010 or something like that. And I asked him the question. He said to me, "That's a really useless question," is what he said. And I, by that time in my life, was quite at ease with playing the fool in front of him. 40 years earlier, I would have been embarrassed, but I wasn't at all embarrassed. I thought it was a very interesting question, and who would I ask except you? You're the only person who might know. He just said, well, what good would it do to have that answer? And again, I said, I just was fascinated by the question, and I was ready to go with, do you go from a diamond to an emerald? How does it work? But first he said, it's a useless question, and he wasn't going to answer it. This is not the first time this happened. Swami will reject something, and then he'll be silent, and then something will come to him. So when I asked him how long, are you a diamond? First he dismissed it, and then he said, all time is short compared to eternity, which was, of course, an answer that had, endless ramifications. From our human perspective, to get from a diamond to a God-realized master looks like a long time. But compared to eternity, it's nothing, which is also, that relates also to when God realization comes to us. It doesn't matter how many millions of lifetimes we've had, compared to eternity, all time is short. When Swamiji was very unwell once, and I went to see him in Europe, and I was just greeting him, "How are you feeling, sir?" And I'd heard that he'd been very unwell. He said, not very well. He said, "How are you feeling?" He said, "Not very well." He said, "But compared to eternity, compared to an eternity of bliss," that's what he said. So, my body's sick for a few years. Compared to an eternity of bliss, what difference does it make? So it's a lovely question. But the end point is, because we are all moving toward the human level because the human nervous system is sophisticated enough that we can live in a human body and experience infinity. That's what the Master does. Master lived in a physical human body, but the human body, it was sophisticated enough that you can perceive eternity. I believe this is accurate, that the scientists tell us that we don't use most of our brain. But the potential is there in our nervous system. It's not really, scientists think it's very inefficient, but it's not. It's that the human body is capable, when we use it as Divine Mother intended for us to really use it, it's capable of being, you can be both physical and infinite at the same time with the human body. And because all jivas are seeking union with God, because all sentient beings are trying to escape pain and increase happiness, and we will always be suffering until we are free in God. So we will constantly be pushing, whether we're aware of it or not, whether we're, dynamic or not. So when those animals, any animal, gets in close proximity to a human being, its evolution is greatly accelerated. Because instead of just hanging out in the forest and, trying to find something to eat and trying to avoid being eaten, and then every so often getting to mate or raise babies or have a new banana or something like that, it has the opportunity to just have a whole new experience. I mean, think of use a dog as an example. Think of a wild dog trying to live versus a dog whose food and health and everything is completely taken care of. It gets to watch television, it gets to listen to music, it gets to hear interesting conversation, it gets to go riding in the car, it gets to see, the ocean. It has all these experiences which gradually expand its reality. And the way that the reincarnation works, as Swami put this in his Raja Yoga course, it's just perfect. We manifest a body that is capable, that is a vehicle, that is the appropriate vehicle for us to express the full potential of consciousness that we have. And we shed that body and get another one when we have used up that potential, whether that's just one round as a dog or lots of rounds as a dog, and going from a wild dog to a prize-winning show dog, or from breed to breed. I mean, I don't know any of this, but we manifest the body that allows us to express the full consciousness that we are capable of expressing. And when that body proves inadequate, then we get to shed it and we get to move into one that gets bigger, until we get to be a dog, a horse, or a monkey. And I know some people want to say, but the elephants, but the dolphins. I'm just telling you what Master said. From that level is when we begin to be able to transition into being human. Now, just to confuse it, it is said that Lahiri Mahashaya was working on a technique where animals could be liberated directly without having to go through the human level. What that could possibly mean is way beyond me. I'm just putting it out there because it was told to me. And when it was told to me, actually Swami said it, but sort of in the same way, which is like, what? Who knows what that really means, but that's what he was, quote, working on, maybe for a higher age. So I always think about when dogs, for example, who are quite lively creatures, I've never had my own dog. Well, there was a dog in our family very briefly when I was very young, but I never bonded with it. I'm a little too addicted to intellectual content to be like super attuned to animals. It just has never been my thing because they don't speak any language that I speak. But I like them, but I've never been close with any animal. Let me just finish the thought here. Oh, yes. But I see the dogs, because everybody has dogs in the neighborhood and so on. And You know, dogs are just always awake and ready, or most of the time they're awake and ready, and they're pulling on the leash, and they're looking at the bush, and they're crossing over there, and they're staring at me, and they're chasing my bicycle, and they're greeting the other dog. I mean, they're just boom, boom, they're so busy, so busy. And with all due respect, their preoccupations are a little trivial. And I can imagine when a dog gets to the point where he gets to be a service dog, he gets to help someone, he gets to work for the police, he gets to sniff the bags in the airport to see if anybody's bringing in drugs. You know, just like I was just thinking, if I were a dog, what a relief, meaningful work. You know, just how excited can I get about just going out for a walk day after day? But you could see why they would. They would be, you know, just think of it. Well, Swami put it this way. Swami said at one point, he said, everyone looks the same to me now. He said, even animals. He said, they're just egos on the spectrum from some level of delusion to some level of realization. He says the animals are there just the same. It's just they're all growing, we're all growing toward perfect awareness, and we're all at some stage where we don't quite have it. So if I'm a dog and I'm being like the river being drawn to the sea, and suddenly I can give my life meaning and really give my heart more than just in affection, but in actual useful work, I could see how happy I would be to be able to do that. I really honestly think it's a memory. I think I remember somehow. I mean, I don't really, but I do feel it, like what a relief it was to finally be able to be actually making a contribution to this world. So all of that is to say, and this is, I hope, interesting and a long sort of byway here, is the unique quality about the human being is that we suddenly have a degree, sufficient self-awareness combined with autonomy, with self-will. So the lizard can't really choose to be a good lizard or a bad lizard. He's just a lizard, you know? He's not like a perverted lizard or a particularly mean lizard. There's just not a lot of space for those kinds of choices. He just tries to live. He does what he's instinctively supposed to do. Dogs get a lot more personality. And I'm told by someone who knows a lot about dogs, she told me that she got a job as a nanny for some very wealthy person who had dogs. The person had a couple of dogs, and she wanted a nanny for her dogs. And my friend, who also had 2 dogs of her own, was very happy to take the job because then all 4 dogs were together. But she said she had to leave the job because one of her employer's dogs was perverse. And he was beginning to infect her dog, and her dog was becoming perverse. Now, I don't really know what that means in a dog, but that's basically what she said. And she said that he was a bad companion for her dog, and so she gave up the job, went somewhere else because she didn't want her dogs to be corrupted like that. But human beings can really do that because we can objectify our experience and we can start choosing. And also, human beings can develop, what would you call it, unnatural appetites. You know, a lizard is not likely to overeat, you know, or not exercise enough, or dissipate its energy in mating with its partner, whatever it might be, or develop an appetite for having many, many concubines instead of just its one lizard partner, whatever, however you think about it. It makes you smile because you can't imagine it. But what I'm describing is things that human beings do all the time, isn't it? You know, and much worse and much more bizarre, because the pain, the happiness-pain duality is there, but the human consciousness is aware enough to develop, to become interested and define its happiness in ways that are not ultimately going to be fulfilling. They have a short-term thrill to them, perhaps, but they're they aren't fundamentally in harmony with the way the human being is made. And so the ultimate effect of that, which will take more than a short period of time to manifest itself, the ultimate result of that is going to be more pain, not less. This is when you go to extreme things like alcoholism, or heroin addiction, or oversensuality, or greed for money that causes you to lose all sense of proportion. Gambling, an addiction for gambling, which is a greed for money, or just on and on it goes. A preference for a glutton, just a preference for so much food that's really unhealthy for you, that your body just begins to disintegrate, and gradually you can't even live as a normal person. All of those things. This is all the capability of the jiva once it gets its hands on a human body, once it gets itself into a human body. Which is why it takes us so long. Which is why it takes us millions of incarnations, because once we're at that level, the movement toward upliftment is not automatic. So all of this brings us back very simply to this verse. Let man uplift himself by his own effort, and let him not debase himself. Indeed, oneself is his own greatest friend, or, if he so chooses, his own greatest enemy. So that is to say, because it's the small s self, it's the part of me that can make my own decisions. And this word debase is a really interesting word. Debase, Swami describes it. I mean, you have the idea that it's lowering you. And this is an actual reference to the chakras. When you think about the chakras this way, all of the chakras contribute an important vibration that is essential for the wholeness of our human expression. But the chakras, in order to operate in that way, need to be guided from the spiritual eye. The spiritual eye and the medulla are the two poles of the same chakra. This is the sixth chakra, and it's just one chakra. And what this is, and that the two poles are a beautiful microcosm window into the essential challenge of our movement towards self-realization, is that we are the infinite self, but we have become confused and we don't know it. It's just as simple as that. And the longer we've been confused, the more we build up around us to support that idea. So we identify with our limited self instead of our infinite self. And our limited self, begins with the physical bodies that we occupy. It's very interesting if you stand back from it a little bit and really just think about how much the physical body affects us. And I don't just mean that it's, that you're sleepy, or that it's out of sorts, or it's allergic to something and you're eating something that makes you tired, or whatever that might be. I just mean the very fact that you're in it, that we're in it. And our view of the world is limited by its physical position, and our understanding of pretty much everything is related to the one we inhabit. I remember on one of the trips that I took to India for about 20 years, starting in the late 80s, every year or every other year, I was one of the leaders of a pilgrimage trip that we would take to India. Now, within Ananda, there's an enormous amount of exchange with India, and on the whole planet, there's a lot of exchange. In 1987, it was a little bit newer, and 87. It was, it would have been 86, just to be accurate. And I think it might have even been 86, but it was certainly one of the early trips. We were flying back from New Delhi back to the United States, and I think there were three American women, who were bringing orphans, Indian-born orphans. Each woman was taking care of two of these orphans, little tiny babies, very young babies, not walking children, but very young babies in these little portable baskets. And these women were doing this out of selfless service. They just were volunteers. They would fly to India. They would pick up two babies and they would bring them back to the U.S. where a whole adoption had already been arranged. So there they were carrying these babies, and the babies all had American names, William John Bowman. So there would be this tiny little brown child who until then had been called Ganesha or Gopal or something like that, was now William John Bowman. And they would call him William John because that's who he was now. And it was interesting because each woman had two babies, and we were sort of talking with them and said, this is like a 15-hour flight. How are you going to manage these two babies? Oh, she said, you'll see. Everyone on the plane will help me. And they were absolutely right. I mean, these 6 babies going on this incredible, life-changing journey, everybody on the plane was aware of them, and we were all just there to do anything we could to help William John and his friend Jeffrey and the other one just make it over in time. And my goodness, we all just sat there and thought, what's about to happen? And there were these, mother and father somewhere in Wisconsin or Arizona or wherever they were, who were just holding their breath because their son or daughter was about to arrive. It's just like, what a wild story it is, this business of being identified. So now, these little children, who were beautiful little brown children, were about to just go into this American white world, and there would be no hint of that beautiful lilting English that people who grow up in India learn to speak. They'd speak with a Southern accent or a Texas drawl, or in New York, and it would just be completely who they are. And they would identify, and I keep touching my medulla because this is where the egoic self, and I don't mean egotistical per se, ego is the soul identified with the qualities of limitation of its incarnation. The soul identified with the body. And that body is the astral and also the causal body. Ego persists. And because it's identified with this one body, by definition, it cannot feel itself in all bodies. Master could feel himself in all bodies. Lahiri Mahashaya was gasping for air when a ship sank in Japan. He was in his place in Varanasi, and he suddenly began gasping for air because hundreds of people were dying in a ferry boat accident in Japan. And he was as much in their bodies, and suddenly he was gasping for air. Just right in his meditation room, he was suffering with them. And Master sometimes couldn't walk properly because, to use his own words, he was in so many bodies, he would forget which one he was supposed to keep moving. I mean, just sort of think about that. It happens to people if something happens to their brain. My mother had Parkinson's, and she would just be going along, and then suddenly she would send the same signal to her foot, and her foot just wouldn't receive it. But she knew which foot she was trying to move. She just lost the ability to move it. But Master would forget which hand he was supposed to lift. And then his body would sort of go inert because he would lose connection with it. But it certainly never happened to me. I've managed, when I've had some good meditations, not to be 100% constantly aware of it, but there was no question I never lost, unfortunately, the absolute identity with it. I knew which one was mine all the time. So the ego is the self identified with the body, and then all the limitations that follow. You're one culture, you're one gender, you have one first language, you have one father, you have one mother. You have one set of siblings. Why? Why? If it's all just divine, it's because I've identified and defined myself by this, created a whole series of habits all based on this, that are just habits. And it's, some people, I've traveled a fair amount, and I like to travel, but I'm not as good a traveler as many people that I know, because I tend to remember who I am too much. I've traveled with people who just have this wonderful capacity. They just forget. They're just able to put aside whatever culture they came from and just be in the one that they're in. And I admire it enormously when I see people able to do that. And I try to emulate it as best I can, but it's not as natural to me as it is to some people, that they just let that go, and they just go as they are. What we're doing when we're growing spiritually is we're trying to move our attention from our identity with our limited self to our identity with our divine self. That's just the switch. Just the same chakra, just switching. That's why we meditate, concentrating at the point between the eyebrows. That's why Master said, as much as possible, keep your attention there. Everything that you do, let it be guided from the point between the eyebrows. So all of the chakras, earth, if we talk them in terms of the elements, earth, air, fire, earth, water, air, earth, water, fire, air, heart is air, the throat is ether, which is not ether like what puts you to sleep when you're having an operation, but ether is like a more subtle substance than air. It's the substance that fills space. That's all I can say. And then super ether is what how Master used English to describe the quality of the spiritual eye. But all of those qualities, the qualities of water, fire, and earth, especially the three lower chakras, speaking of them, all of those vibrations, the steadfastness of earth, the creative flexibility of water, the power of fire, these are what we must bring to bear if we're going to realize our divine potential. But the energy needs to flow through those chakras and up to the spiritual eye. The difficulty is many people do not live guided by the spiritual eye. They allow whatever impulses arise in the chakras to just express. Whatever it might be, it just expresses. And it's not guided from a higher understanding. It's not brought to a focus for our own highest benefit. It just drains out. People talk about the chakras being blocked in that energy can't rise, but the other way that it is that there's actually like an open door from the chakra. So instead of the energy becoming interiorized and focused and elevated, it just simply pours out. An example of that would be a person who has a lot of willpower, fire energy, but is just constantly angry and is always trying to dominate other people and yells a lot and is crabby all the time. So there's lots of fire energy, but it never produces anything. It never becomes self-will translated into self-directed self-control of energy. It's just there's lots of fire energy and it just burns up everything around you. Or second chakra energy, which is creative energy that can be used for art or for music or for writing or for divine inspiration. But it can also just be used restlessly, just moving a person in all directions, and can also develop as a desire for sensual experience. Second chakra energy controls the genitals and the sexual organs. And second chakra energy can just be always obsessively seeking sexual experience. And lots of energy gets expressed, but none of it gets interiorized or focused or elevated. And that's the self, you see. That's the ego. I'm identified with the ego. I just do whatever I feel like doing. I'm not identified with the divine self, and so the energy is lost. Now, a person from an egoic position can still look at the happiness-pain equation, and say, this is not working for me. This is a minute of pleasure that leads me to a lifetime of pain, and it's just not worth it. So then we're still acting from our identity with our limited self, but we've begun to learn something about it. We've begun to learn that even though a piece of me is going to want to head out in this direction, the other part of me doesn't want to. And this is when we become different. And we become different for a really simple reason. We've tried it, and it didn't work. Master said, and it's a very terrifying statement, but it's also very interesting. He said, we learn from our experience. And therefore, anything that you know about the pain and happiness equation is because you've tried it. Not because somebody told you, but because you've tried it. And if you have a disinclination now, it's because you went through it and you found out what the result would be. Now think how many incarnations that means. Because we see people all over the place behaving in horrible manners, and they just keep doing it. And some of them grow rich, famous, and recognized by society, and die happily at the age of 90 with all their grandchildren around them. And you know that they're despicable people, or just low consciousness. But just because you get away with it in one birth to death cycle doesn't mean that the karma is not stacking up. It just means that it hasn't caught up with you yet. Because we have all what Master called conflicting cross currents of ego. Instant karma is good karma. If in the moment that you do it, you reap the consequences of it, then that's good karma, because you know right in the moment. I have an intermittent fear of heights. Much of the time I'm afraid of heights, but every so often I'm not. And I just am fine. So because I know that sometimes I'm just fine, I don't always remember. I was in Israel on the first pilgrimage trip I took, and we were at Qumran, which is the ruins of an Essene community from back at the time of Jesus and before. It's the location where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in a cave. And it's this desert location, and most of the time you can walk past the ruins to these sandy cliffs, and you can walk on this little trail, and you can sort of get into some of the caves. It's very nice. The first trip I took to Israel, I was there. I was with a group of about 30, and we had this American Israeli. He'd emigrated to Israel some decades before, American man, strong man. And we were walking, and it was a cliff trail, but it was at least 4 feet wide. It wasn't like an edge or something. And sometimes the way the fear expresses itself to me is if the road turns. And so the trail was just like this, and then it turned, and I couldn't see it. And when I couldn't see it, I just developed this panic, this just absolute panic. And I was toward the front of the 30 people, and I just turned around and I began moving as fast as I could move. I mean, past all these other people who were also walking, but just through them, I was just panicking, running back. And I ran right into this man named Marty, and thank God, he'd been in the Israeli army, as everyone has been, so he knew how to deal with stuff like this. And he could just tell that I'd lost my mind. And he just grabbed my wrist. I can still feel it, like that. And sort of as soon as he was holding me like that, then the mood passed. So all of that is just that experience. But here's the interesting part. I had fallen into a very negative train of thought. I can't quite remember now exactly what I was thinking, but I had gotten myself, I was in Qumran, I'm in Israel for the first time. You would think that there would be something helpful I could do with my mind, but instead of that, whatever was worrying me or whoever I was upset with, and you know how those stories go. So I was having a heated conversation with somebody who wasn't anywhere near me. And I wasn't really being very nice. That's what I was doing. I was just walking along like that, and bam, this terrible, like, catastrophe came across my consciousness. Oh, I mean, it was like as soon as he grabbed my hand like that, it was like, you're in one of the power spots of the universe. You don't just get away with that kind of mental nastiness, you know? It's just no way. And I just was so glad just to be caught out in it. I mean, I didn't have to explain it to anyone. My own vertigo was sufficient for the explanation. But whoa, it was, and I mean, I'm sure that was it. It was just one-to-one. The other instant karma that I had, which was fabulous, it was our first or second trip to Varanasi, same cycle of leading these pilgrimages. And it might have been our first trip there. We had a very nice man who was our guide, but we didn't know each other very well. Over the course of 20 years when we did these tours, we got to be very good friends with our guides, and we were able to work together to make our trip just what we wanted it to be. But this was early on, and this man was extremely proud of his city, which was very ancient, and he quite sensibly felt that he knew more than we did about what we should go and see. So he hijacked our bus. That's how I feel about it. We had our own idea about where we were going to go, but he was determined to take us. There are lots of famous temples in Varanasi, but this one was a very, very ancient Durga temple, but everyone called it the monkey temple because it was filled with monkeys. In fact, the whole city of Varanasi is filled with monkeys. I understand it's sort of a problem because their vegetarian ahimsa doesn't allow them to harm the monkeys, but they just keep multiplying. But there were a lot of monkeys at this temple. It was a very old temple. It was not my favorite aspect of India because it was covered with monkey poop, and it was just in general not a very clean and bright place. But it was a very ancient temple with a very ancient murti in it. And just to make it worse, there was some old pujari there, priest there, who, because I was one of the group leaders, he was determined that I should wear this marigold garland, except the marigold garland was past its expiration date. And marigolds have a very pungent odor as they begin to turn to the dust from whence they came. So he wanted me to wear this marigold garland. I did not want to wear it because its smell was a little putrid to me. So he would put it on me, and then I would find a way to take it off and leave it somewhere, and then he would find it, and he would come and find me again and put it on me. So that was not pleasant. The place was not pleasant. I was annoyed with our guide for having hijacked us to come here, and I just was pretty mad at India in general, and specifically quite displeased about Durga because of the whole thing. Durga, the Murti, not Durga, my friend, who was one of the co-leaders. And there were all these monkeys, and you had to sort of always be watching with the monkeys. And in all of this, like this about Durga and about this temple and how, why can't they keep it cleaner and, all this stuff, I just forgot, I lost track of the monkeys. And so I got myself in the middle of the monkeys, which is like the monkeys were on both sides of me, which you never do because the monkeys like to be together. And so this monkey decided that I was really, I needed a lesson. The monkey actually jumped on my back. And apparently, because I was told later, I did become very reactive, but instead of being fearful, I pulled the monkey off my back. I threw it on the ground, and this part I remember, and I said, "Get off of me, you filthy thing," except I screamed it out to the monkey like that. The monkey then ran over to me and closed his mouth around, fortunately, my skirt rather than my leg. But he just closed its mouth around my skirt, and then I'm just mad. "Let go of me, you awful creature," like this. And I pulled until I ripped, the monkey took a big mouthful out of my skirt, but I got the rest of my skirt back. By this time, of course, everybody in the whole temple is there, including the man with the garland. The whole thing, we're all there, and they kind of pushed all the monkeys back like this. And whoa. I said, Durga, I'm so sorry. Ma Durga, please forgive me. It was just like, how dare you, you little American, whippersnapper. You're coming where I have been reigning for millennia, and you dare to have an opinion about something as trivial as monkeys. It was just like, whoa. But I was so grateful. Just the same thing. There I was just running this negative story. And by the grace of God, just like that. Otherwise, we do this for lifetimes, don't we? Yeah. I came back home to America, and I went to the local fabric store, and I got this decal, which was this monkey like this. And I mended the skirt with that monkey on it, and I wore that skirt to India for years because every time I looked at it, it reminded me, don't be so arrogant, girl. There's a lot more going on than you know. So in this way, and I'm using those wonderful examples, 2 wonderful examples in my life of instant karma, where the cause and effect was so clear, I knew exactly what the issue was. But unfortunately, most of the time, it's not. Unfortunately, because of the conflicting cross currents of ego. I may be mean, but I also have a lot of willpower. And I may antagonize a lot of people, but I can also make friends, and my friends are stronger than the people I antagonize. These are the conflicting cross currents of ego. I may have good karma because at one point I was a more noble person than I am now. So I still keep getting born into prosperity. But now I'm such a selfish so-and-so that I'm just spending all that bad karma, but I still have all that money to fritter away. It's going to take me a few lifetimes before it all balances out and that bad karma begins to come on me. And then, over a long period of time, I will figure out the cause and effect when I look at the happiness-pain equation. And then I will learn. So all of us can look at things in our lives that it's not a discipline to avoid it. Like, it's not a discipline for me, I'll speak personally in a very trivial, it's not a discipline for me to eat salad every day. I love salad. It's not a discipline for me to avoid going to McDonald's and having Big Macs. I just don't think I could possibly do that. Practically the last, I believe it may have been the last non-vegetarian food I ate was actually a hamburger at some hamburger joint up in the hills not very far from here. And because I've lived in this area since I was 18 in one way or another. I started living here when I was 18. I returned when I was 40. I was here for, what would it be? It would have been about 5 years. And then I returned when I was 40. And I had this hamburger, and then I dreamt about it. But it wasn't, I dreamt about the whole hamburger on the bun with the lettuce and the tomato and the whole thing like this. And it was in my blood veins, but whole, as if it had never been masticated, as if it had just been like put in there intravenously. And it moved around, like a cartoon. It moved around like a cartoon, this big lump, which was under my skin, but was actually a hamburger, tomato, onion, and lettuce and all. And it just moved through my skin like this. It was so freaky. I was near the end of it anyway, but that was really close to the end. That was certainly the end of hamburger. It never came back again. But I don't have to discipline myself. And in fact, even becoming a vegetarian was just pretty much of a nothing event. It just seemed like a good idea. Okay, that was that. How do I know that? I know that because, again, to speak for myself, I've been very, very, very health conscious since I was 18. I just became very health conscious. And it crossed my mind relatively recently, it's because you've been sick in a lot of lives. It's just like that. So here I am, I'm an invincible teenager, but I'm terribly conscious of the vulnerability of the body and the necessity to hydrate and give it good food and to breathe clean air and to exercise. It's just all these things are like, why? Because I didn't. So now I do. It just, there you are. And Master said that means if you're not inclined to be a murderer, It's because you have been. And you tried to solve your problems by murdering. I remember once when I was very angry about something, and there seemed to be a person, and I just actually, the thought crossed my mind. It was just a past life memory. The thought crossed my mind. If I could eliminate this person from the planet, then everything would be much better for me. And of course, a part of me even simultaneously thought, really? You actually think if you put the happiness-pain equation in front of you, that that's really going to work? But I felt it so, it came on me so powerfully that I recognized, oh, yeah, I could see how a person could feel that way. They could just be so taken over for the moment, they just wouldn't be able to keep their head straight. Just like night after night, if you eat that pint of ice cream, you know it's not good for you, you suffer for it, but in the moment, you still want to do it until the pain-happiness equation somehow penetrates. And I mean, that's what I'm working with every day. I'm sure that's what all of you are working with every day. We're always caught between the superconscious aspiration and the subconscious thought that if I put out less energy, I'll be happier. And that's the battle of Kurukshetra, right there. That's where the two forces come together, and we always are having to do this. The self can either be your friend or the self can be your enemy. But it says, let me read it again, wherever we were, let man uplift himself by his own effort. Indeed, oneself is his own greatest friend, if your willpower is directed toward your true happiness, or, if he so chooses, his own greatest enemy. But it says, let him not debase himself. I started there a little while ago with the different chakras, saying how the energy will just drain out. That's what it means to debase yourself. It means to deliberately do things that bring your energy down, that emphasize your animal nature rather than your divine nature. And we don't want to, as Swamiji said, we will do things that are not helpful to our happiness, but there's no point in developing a complex about it. The issue, what we did is bad enough. We don't have to also then just create a whole second layer on top of it of guilt and fear and all like this. Someone was just asking me, does it happen just today? Just like how do the masters see us? How did Swamiji regard us? We were talking about Swami Kriyananda's incredible patience with our behavior. And they asked me something like, how did Swami regard us? And it was actually interesting because I could feel it. I know exactly how Swami regarded us. And his regard, he had this wonderful phrase, I understand why you feel that way. It really came into focus for me when there was this controversy in the community where some people thought one thing was a good idea, some people thought another. And Swami just received everybody's input without taking a position as it happened in that situation. And whoever called him, he would say, I understand why you feel that way. And that wasn't like a technique. It was that he did. Given who you are, given your karmic inclinations, given your perception of the pain-happiness equation, I understand how you feel this way. Of course you would feel this way. And he did understand. And because he did understand, he was very compassionate. And so this is like, a lot of people talk about the word compassion, but they talk about it because they should talk about it. Because compassion is when I understand why you feel that way. And he would often be more than a little bit sad. Sad not in the sense of depressed or losing hope, but he would just see that, well, the pain-happiness equation was going to have to play itself out a little bit longer. And we were just going to make decisions that were going to not bring us what we hoped they would. I remember I wrote this up in my book about Swami Kriyananda as we have known him. which is a book of first-hand experiences, not all of them mine by any means, but many people's first-hand experiences with Swamiji that I either observed or they told me about. And in this one particular instance, this person was about to make a very important life decision. And I understood why they made that decision. But on the happiness-pain equation, it wasn't going to work out well. And Swamiji knew it was an odd sort of situation. I knew that the person was going to come and ask Swamiji, and I knew what the situation was, and I knew that he wasn't aware of it. So I called him and I said, so-and-so's coming to see you, and here's what the story is. So he had time to think about it. Not that he absolutely needed time, but he appreciated. I knew him. I knew that he would appreciate having time. So when they arrived, he was not going to be shocked or caught unawares. So he didn't favor the decision that was about to be made, but he also perceived, no matter how delicately he tried to explain to the person, that this was not really going to work out on the pain-happiness equation. It wasn't going to work. But the person was set. They were set on what they were going to do, and so somehow Swami finessed it a little bit, but there was still some doubt in the person's mind, or the person needed a clarification. Well, you know, something like, you do bless what I'm doing, don't you, Swamiji? And Swami said, I bless you, I always bless you. And he didn't say, I bless what you're doing. He was very careful not to say that, because he didn't. But I bless you, I always bless you. And then they walked out and said, Swami approves my decision, which he didn't. But he just saw, I understand why you feel that way. And he wanted to spare them the suffering that inevitably resulted and was very intense. But the karma had to play itself out. And on the other hand, when I would say that Swami was sad, what he was, how would I say it? Let me just try to think for a moment. He was serious. He would be serious. He wouldn't be frivolous. He wouldn't be laughing it off. He wouldn't be spouting spiritual aphorisms that were not really helpful in the moment. He would just be slightly withdrawn and very serious, because he could see that we had more to learn. And even though he wanted to speed us through or lift us around those experiences, he just saw that those experiences were necessary. And so that's how he would be. But at the same time, you see, he knew that we would learn, and that all time was short compared to eternity. So that's why I mean, like, he wasn't really like distraught over it like a mother can be when her child makes the wrong decision, like a human mother can be, or a wife or a husband or a friend. You know, you see somebody doing the wrong thing and you're just so upset. Although there were occasions, now that to be fair, this person that Swamiji felt very close to, in a human as well as a spiritual way, who was a friend, made the decision to leave the ashram and just follow another way of life. Swami said, I cried all night, because he knew that this person was starting on a trajectory that would take a while to finish. Master commented about various people who left the ashram of Mount Washington, who left him. One man who left him in a very dramatic way and betrayed him, took all Master's money, filed a lawsuit against him, all these things. Master said, 3 more lifetimes he'll be liberated. It would take him 3 lifetimes to go through that. Another man who left the ashram, Master said, it'll be, I think he said, 100 lifetimes before he comes back to the point he was when he made that decision to go away. So the Masters want to help us through this, but if we really haven't learned the lesson, they just have to stand back and Let us learn it. Because only when we are receptive to their uplifting vibrations, and therefore, you see, what experience does for us is it gives us a tangible, let me think how to say it. Everything is vibration. When we think back about our past experiences, there's no thing there. It's not like a granite mountain that just is sitting there. It's like what happened to me 15 years ago, what happened to me 10 lifetimes ago. The vibration of it may be a vibration in my chakras. Let's say I was betrayed, and I became very, very angry. And that became a vibration in the appropriate chakra that represents, the chakras represent a spectrum from God realization to total delusion. And every thought and action that we have has a certain vibration, just like a piano keyboard does. And, certain kinds of actions have certain vibrations on this spectrum between pure wisdom and pure delusion. So somebody betrays me, maybe because I was a super stinker and they got really mad at me. So I have all that stinker vibration, which is also part of me. But then I became enraged with them for betraying me. So now I plant in my chakras a vibration of energy that is those qualities. And that energy pattern, when the physical body dies, that energy pattern, which is what we call the astral body, it goes with us to the astral world. And our limited identification is not just for the material body, but also for the astral body, for the energy pattern of consciousness. In the astral world, I'm myself, and I vibrate with that energy pattern. The astral world is more subtle, but I don't get to not be myself. This is the shocking thing, apparently, when people die, which is that I don't. You think you would, but you don't. You're just still there because you're still identified with your astral body, which is your vibratory body. So I have these certain vibrations in me that both compel me in certain directions to act and also attract to me the vibrations that are correct to act upon those experiences. And so I gradually have the experience necessary to understand what the consequences of my anger are, or my stinkerness, whatever it might be. I keep attracting to myself an opportunity to find out in the pain-happiness equation sort of how this works. Now, I found out when you're in Varanasi at an ancient temple, don't think bad thoughts about the Murti and about the presiding deity. I found out immediately that was a really, really bad idea. When you're walking on a cliff, don't start an angry conversation with someone who isn't there or with someone who is there, because it will activate some kind of a response. But there's a lot of other things that I and all of us carry that we don't see the cause and effect relationship until it comes to us. So at the age of 18, I suddenly realized that hydration and whole foods are extremely important. And I'm not as strict as I was then, but I was very strict for many years, just really, really taking care of my physical body. How did I already know that? Well, because I didn't. How many lifetimes did I overindulge, overuse, disregard the laws of health, get sick, suffer? And it was a vibration. And then I remembered I don't have to do that anymore. So then the self becomes my friend, because the self is now reminding me of these experiences. And one wonderful piece of this whole equation, based on Master saying that he was a diamond, everything between being a diamond and being God realization was the path that Master walked. And Jesus Christ and Krishna and Sri Ramakrishna, every Buddha, every self-realized master at some point wasn't. And when they weren't, they were having the experiences they needed to teach them about the pain-happiness equation, learning the cause and effect, gradually making even their limited self the friend of their higher consciousness. So that means every vibration of consciousness that we go through, and I don't think it means literally every experience, but every vibration. I mean, you can be furious as a Bedouin in the desert somewhere, and you can be enraged as a Hawaiian fisherman. And it's not being a fisherman or being a Bedouin, it's being enraged. And so we go through, again, if you think of it as the piano keyboard, which it's not really that linear, but it still gives you a picture, you have to go through every note, and everybody who's singing that note, you can learn that note from a lot of different places. Once you know that note, you can go into something else. But it's not merely that Swamiji can have compassion, but Swamiji has been there. And what made him into who he is now, what made him into someone who understood so many things that I didn't understand, was because Swamiji did not like slang. He was a very highly educated man, very refined, loved Shakespeare and beautiful poetry and writing. He didn't really like slang at all. And it was also very funny because slang has a vibration. And whenever, and only as a joke, would Swami ever use a slang phrase. Like he had some experience was really unpleasant, and he said, yes, it was really not a very uplifting situation. In fact, he said, it was, and then he went like this, the pits. Just like that. And it was so hilarious just to hear him say that. It was just so incongruous with the aura of his energy for him to just throw out a phrase like that, which anybody else, or most anybody else, could have just said, and it would have just gone right by. So he didn't like slang, but he loved the expression, been there, done that. He thought it was such a marvelous use of language. It expressed so much. So, been there, done that. And that's where I'm going, is one of the reasons Swami could be so compassionate and also so optimistic, even in his compassion, because he'd been there, he'd done that. And he just knew that if you didn't understand it, you had to go through it. There was my friend, and he was doing his very best to communicate to them that you don't really have to do this. You can just see through this. You can see the end of this before you start. But unfortunately, it turned out to be otherwise. But what that does, what that has done for me, and I hope can do for you, one is you don't have to be embarrassed about anything. There's just nothing you can do that can surprise or shock the masters. It's impossible. By definition, it's impossible. Because they came into a human body and they used their free will to figure it out. By the time they're an avatar, of course, they're not compelled by these things anymore. But been there, done that. So if you're standing right in the middle, if I'm standing right in the middle of some, super annoying, but nonetheless compelling inclination that just is driving you in a direction that part of you doesn't want to go and part of you does want to go. When I was caught up in a kerfuffle of desires that were trying to take me, this was after I was at Ananda, that just, it was annoying. And in the morning when I would meditate, I would say to Master, look, you give me an opportunity, to make the wrong decision. You know full well I'm going to make it. So the only way we're going to get through this day is that you have to block every opportunity that comes to me for me to make a mistake. And I said, and you also know that when you block the opportunity, I'm going to try to persuade you to change your mind. But let's just take this a day at a time. Just get me through today, and I'll be darned if you didn't do that for me. And I was true to my word. I was really annoyed when my desires were thwarted, but deeply grateful when the day was over and we'd made it through one more day. But that's the way you have to be. Look, I understand the way you feel that way. That I understand why you feel that way, Master says, because been there, done that. And given the whole context of what you're doing, yeah, that would be the way that you would move. But let's make the self our true friend instead of making it our enemy. That's the spiritual path. That's why every epic is a war. It's not because they were written by men who are warlike, and if women were in charge, we'd write little tales of quilting at home. No, that's not at all what the story is. That's ridiculous. It's because it is a war. It is a war. Because the pain-happiness equation has to be sorted out. And then it just becomes who you are. It's not about should, ought to, want, nothing. It's just who you are. I was traveling with a friend of mine who, diet for me is not my most difficult issue. Fasting is not, I'm no good at not eating. I'm very, very poor at not eating. Master has this 9-day diet, this 9-day cleansing diet. Some of you may know about it. But our joke was, well, I'm so good at the 9-day diet, I can finish it in just 3 days. Which about is my relationship to fasting. I'm terrible. But eating healthy food is effortless for me. In fact, I really prefer it. I traveled with a friend once who had a weakness at that time for sweets, really. So we're on vacation together. So to her, that means chocolate milkshake for breakfast. And I just thought, oh, Lord, please don't make me do that. I'm on vacation. I get to have eggs and toast and potatoes and orange juice. It's just like, makes me so happy, and fresh fruit and yogurt and like this. But it just depends on who we are, whatever lessons we have. Some things are easy and some things are hard. Master's been through it all. So let's see, what does he say? Indeed, oneself is his own greatest friend, or if he chooses, his own greatest enemy. Let us make the self our friend. God bless you.